Let me open up this review with the admission that I have not finished this game. I took the opportunity of playing it for a week when Bethesda announced I would be giving people a free trial after E3 2019, so I thought it would be a good time to try it, since the game had some more time in the oven to fix the unavoidable cavalcade of bugs that the game shipped with originally back in November 2018. In the end, I managed to get around 18 hours under my belt and reach level 20, as you can see from the in-game time tracker, so beware that my opinion is solely based on what I've played. This is what my world map looks like at the time of recording, so anything I'm going to discuss refers to these areas I've explored. As you can see, I've mostly explored one of the 6 areas in the game, but in order to speed things up, I hurried towards the southern area towards the end of my time with the game to see one of the main quest lines come to conclusion. So while this may only be a fraction of what I usually put into a Fallout game, I still feel that my opinion on the matter is relevant enough, because these games don't tend to change much over time. I have fairly conflicting opinions towards the later first-person Fallout games. The ones developed by Bethesda are always to be loved for their better halves and in spite of their worse halves. This means that while the gameplay overall, the visual fidelity and the main narratives tend to be rather lackluster, the settings, themes, settlements, side quests and exploration are what usually carry these titles and what makes them bearable. So imagine my surprise when Bethesda announced that their newest entry in the series would focus on an attempt at making a multiplayer Fallout game rather than a single-player narrative. To me, the idea sounded utterly ludicrous from the start, which was why I had almost no interest in actually playing this game, let alone purchase it in the first place. They boldly announced that they wouldn't include any NPCs in this world, and they expected that real players would fill that role somehow. You would be truly wandering a dead wasteland filled only with enemies, some scant merchants, robots, and a handful of other players. But I don't want to start this review overly harshly. Even though I do regularly criticize Bethesda games for looking about a generation behind the rest of the planet, Fallout 76's version of West Virginia can actually be a really beautiful place to behold and trek through. It's certainly a vast improvement over the monochromatic nightmare that was the capital wasteland, and I don't think that there's no fun to be had with Fallout 76. Once things get going and you're back in the mindset of wandering out into the wastes and exploring stuff, it can present some entertainment for a few hours. Bethesda usually build their games in a way that is fairly conducive to exploratory gameplay, and that is not lost in Fallout 76. The problem is that what you're exploring is basically all the same. Every town feels identical because there's only a few things you can find there. Combats, robots,
random documents and audio logs.
And these things are basically everywhere. There are only really a handful of things I've seen during my time with Fallout 76 that stood out to me and that felt unique and not merely another chance for the game to dump you into one of its linear quests where the only thing you get to do is fight a bunch of enemies. One of my favorite quests that I did is called Wasted on Nukashine, which starts when you find an abandoned frat house. Once you stumble across it, you're simply tasked with exploring the house until you end up finding a bottle of liquor called Nukashine. While you're there, you can stumble upon plenty of writing indicating that this fraternity is mostly focused on mischief and partying, which has earned them quite a reputation. You can drink that bottle of Nukashine, which ends up giving you a hallucination of enemies called party crashers to further develop this theme that the people of this fraternity were all about partying and little else. After hallucination wanes, the game actually transports you halfway across the map, implying that you went way off the deep end in your drunken stupor. Unfortunately, the game managed to disconnect from the servers at this point, so I got transported to a far closer location upon reloading the game. We'll talk more about the technical issues of this game later. Once I made my way back in town, I was not simply given a location marker to find the next step of the quest. I had to solve a riddle on the label of the bottle of Nukashine to find the place it was hinting at. It wasn't a difficult riddle, as it consisted of rather straightforward directions, but it was way more involving than just plonking down another marker on your map. It forced you to look at this environment and not just see a bunch of buildings thrown together, but to see Morgantown, where all of this takes place, as a college town. Once you find the location, you have to be alert enough to actually interact with the empty Nuka-Cola machine to find the hidden door leading downstairs to the pub where the Nukashine is also produced. In there you'll find a robot which was used to test the Nukashine and determine its quality. The robot tasks you with producing some more Nukashine for it. It gives you part of the recipe and mentions that the remainder is locked behind a door to which you have to find a password. Unfortunately, this time the quest gives you a straightforward quest marker, instead of using its surroundings to lead you towards the other frat house where you can find it. Once you make your way back to the pub, you find out what the secret ingredient is, which is inevitably horrifying as it turns out they dumped nuclear waste into it, because this is a Fallout game and we simply can't have nice things. So you go out and harvest the required ingredients, produce fermentable Nukashine, which ends up turning into Nukashine proper, which you then give to the robot. This quest is neatly designed as it takes you to varied nearby locations that are all built and decorated in ways that tell small stories about them. The note mentioning some dude's obsession with a mannequin doll comes to mind, which you can actually see lying with his corpse in the bed right next to where you find the note. And there's almost no combat involved in solving it. Sure, you can encounter some enemies between locations, but you would have encountered those regardless, so they're not immediate factors for how the quest is designed. Unfortunately, players who had their fill after the original release never had the joy of experiencing this excellent quest because it only got released in an update on March 13th of this year. This quest was so cool that by the time I made my way from Morgantown to Charleston and noticed a lot of red arrows pointing around the place, I organically followed them, expecting something neat at the end of it. I hoped that the game would reward me for paying attention to my surroundings. Unfortunately, it turned out that this was simply a marked path you have to traverse for a quest, which tasks you to push a button at the start and at the end of the route, which you have to traverse in a set amount of time. It's so schizophrenic how at one point the game rewards your attentiveness towards your surroundings and at others it's at worst a distraction. I felt so dumb when I ended up doing that quest to follow these arrows because not only did I not get something interesting as a reward for noticing the arrows, but the quest they are actually tied to is mostly just a waste of my time. The biggest reason why I wasted on Nukashine sticks out so prominently to me is because for every quest like this, there's a dozen other quests that are just a variation of go somewhere, find X while killing a bunch of enemies, and listen to some audio logs while you're at it. It just ends up feeling so monotonous after a while, and at its worst it resembles typical MMO grinding. Take for example this main quest called Signal Strength. You trek up the mountain to tune into a radio station, which ends up tasking you with traveling towards a location called the Top of the World. Once you're there, you have to find additional equipment in order to boost the signal strength of the radio broadcast. So first you have to travel halfway across the map to find two separate MacGuffins, then head back to the Top of the World, combine those items, and then head halfway across the map again in order to install that combined item into a radio antenna, before heading back to the Top of the World for a third time to finally get your reward. There's no thinking involved in this quest. You simply head from point to point, hit the use key in front of whatever is necessary, and bam, you're done. Also, this quest needlessly teases you with the quest giver taunting you, telling you she's a raider, and once you encounter her, she turns out to be a robot. Everybody is either a computer or a robot, and it's so annoying how the game taunts you with this at every turn, always hinting towards eventually finding a living, breathing human being who isn't another player. And this fact that there are no other people around really start to wear on you. Every space that is themed around human survival and rebuilding is invariably shown to having been in vain by the time you show up there. There's an uncharacteristic fatalism behind this idea that every person whose voice you get to hear in an audio log will turn out to be dead once you find them. Society has stopped for all intents and purposes. It's entirely antithetical to how Fallout usually presents its worlds. Just think about how this world would feel if you really played it as a single-player game. Nobody else around, just some ruins and audio logs that tell of what happened there. And it always seems like you just came a few days too late for the stuff that happened after the bombs fell. It's like there were tons of interesting things going down in West Virginia, but you're always late to the party and never get to see any of it firsthand. You only get to read and hear about it, and I get that thematically Fallout 76 wants to be framed around the idea that it's the players who rebuild society, but they literally can't. In the other Fallout games, every town and region has some struggle that characterizes it, and the player character usually has some influence over how things play out, a chance for you to make your mark. More so in the older isometric titles and in New Vegas than in the Bethesda developed ones, but in Fallout 76 everything is static. It has to be static because the game wants players of wildly varying character levels interacting with the same map. This means that by necessity this facsimile of West Virginia is frozen in time. As a result, nothing you do feels like you've actually achieved something, right down to the fact that enemies you've just killed might respawn right under your eyes. It makes this game feel rather gamey in the sense that you're always aware that all you're doing is walking on a treadmill that constantly resets itself. Quests don't change how people interact with you because there's nobody to interact with, and that runs completely counter to what Fallout is supposed to be. It's not a round of Overwatch or Call of Duty where you are eternally fighting in some unspecified pretend war that constantly resets itself. What also feels rather strange is how you're rewarded with items, scrap material and cash for completing quests. Because it's not done in the sensible way where you can find a stash somewhere that might tax one of your skills that you've been developing in this game that calls itself an RPG. You just do whatever the quest log tells you to do and stuff is put in your inventory. This non-diegetic way of distributing items is really jarring. You're supposed to be in this dead, hostile world and somehow stuff just ends up in your inventory. This might work for more arcade-like experiences where there's no semblance of them taking place in a real, cohesive world, but it feels so weird and out of place in a Fallout game. Hell, it even happens with entire quest lines. Remember that Wasted on Nukashine quest I mentioned before? You don't simply get that through a note somewhere or by organically searching that frat house in the first place and stumbling upon something more that's going on. You simply walk up to that house, which already sticks out like a sore thumb since the door is bright red, and once you come within a few feet of it, a marker appears on that same door, while you get to see a message of how you've discovered a new location, and it immediately dumps a goal called Attend the Fraternity Party into your quest log. You've just seen this house from the outside, and there's only a small chance you would have even realized that it was a frat house by the signs on the wall, if you've even paid attention to those. This is one of those nasty habits that this game has. It just loves to initiate quests for you whenever it feels like it. I purposely left open my quest visible on screen for a time just to show how ludicrous it can get. Not to mention all those constantly repeating timed quests and events, which are this game's version of the Radiant quest lines. Only this time they're focused on having people cooperate together. I guess this seems like a tacit admission that Bethesda knew most people wouldn't cooperate out of their own volition. During my time with it, I never managed to interact with other people beyond spamming emotes at each other. Everybody wanted to play this game by themselves, and I understand that reasoning completely. I would want to explore this stuff on my own as well. Heck, there was even a building containing a quest where 2 other people were playing alongside me, doing the same quest I was doing right next to me, but we all did it individually. The only instance where I had more of an interaction was with some way higher level dude dropping quite a few healing items in front of me, which I gratefully took. So for what it's worth, the player community is at worst on a live and let live basis, and at best actually kinda cool and welcoming. Eagle-eyed viewers might have also picked up on that sarcastic line from a few paragraphs ago where I said that this game calls itself an RPG. Because Fallout 76 is easily the least RPG-like game of the major releases in this series. You don't start the game by distributing points into your preferred attributes and maybe picking some perks that make your build feel unique. Instead, you just start butt naked with nothing to yourself, a literal blank slate, and the game decides how and when you get to pick between a few random perk cards that influence your character. And you get to swap out all those perk cards how often you want. You're not building a character and sticking to its gameplay style, you're just building a loadout for your character which you can alter anytime it's convenient. There's no need to live with your choices and roll with the punches. If you're low on ammunition and you want to specialize in melee, just equip a few melee focus cards in your set. And it's not like there's a lot of excitement to be had with these perk cards. It's the most by the numbers way you can design RPG character upgrades, because it's literally just, you now have an X% higher chance of doing Y, with some cards having a condition that has to be fulfilled for the card to take effect. This is so boring because it doesn't feel like your character grows in any sense. It's almost tragic how Bethesda had to twist and turn the special system to fit this multiplayer-focused game. Take charisma for example, one of the most rewarding traits you can choose if you like to resolve things through dialogue and really delve deep into the lore of these games and like to get to know the people and the world they inhabit, is rendered useless in the way it worked before, because it had to be retooled from the ground up to enable the multiplayer aspect of this game, since you can't use charisma if there are no NPCs there to use them on. Which means that most perks you can get for charisma determine factors concerning traveling and questing with other people, and since nobody ostensibly does that, it's basically worthless to level that stat up. When you level up in an RPG, you're usually given a breadth of choices to make that influence how your character plays after you've made that choice. Ideally, it changes your playstyle in some way while also increasing the possibilities you as a player are given. But Fallout 76 thinks that minor stat increases are enough of an incentive. You know, like every bad action game that shoehorns in RPG elements for the sake of having token character progression, just to tick off another box in the generic game checklist. But let's stop beating around the bush and face the fact that this game is first and foremost another entry in the survival game category, whose defining feature that made me loathe them is the constant draining of resources. You have a hunger meter, a thirst meter, and your equipment is always on the verge of breaking. You have to maintain everything permanently. I have never understood the appeal of these systems because they're busy work. They detract from the experience of exploring this world and engaging with its combat in favor of having you scavenge around, lugging all sorts of nonsense you pick up throughout your journeys back to some station where you can fix your weapons, armor, and cook some food. And the big irony in Fallout 76's case is that I was almost always on the verge of being over-encumbered. Ammo is scarce if you don't craft it yourself, and weapons seem to break way faster than in previous games, so you'll want to have at least a handful of different weapons on hand to fight. But those weapons take away space you could be filling with healing items, food, and raw materials to craft ammo and repair your stuff. But oh no, those food items can spoil, making them useless to you after a while. You're eternally battling limited inventory and depleting bars until you just have to give up doing quests and do some admin, gather up resources and find places where you can craft shit you desperately need in order to continue with your adventure. Add to that the endless list of raw materials and the even longer list of stuff you can make out of them. Whenever I opened up a cooking station or a tinkerer's workbench, my eyes immediately glazed over because of all the stuff I could technically craft. And all of that food has different effects on you, from the amount of radiation you absorb from it to giving you temporary additional points for your attributes, influencing hunger and thirst, and it just gets way too convoluted to keep track of all of that. Because there's so little immediate payoff to what you get from using those items. The most interesting aspect of crafting, which are the weapons modifications, are so painfully slow to unlock that it's almost not worth bothering, which is also what I would say about the base building aspect. The game is so carelessly made that it can end up spawning you onto a server where someone else has already built their camp at the same exact spot you built it. So you either have to pack up your camp and put it somewhere else, or just search for a different server where that spot is free. Why doesn't the game automatically check on that server to see if that space is occupied already? Another source of constant annoyance are the numerous technical problems. I would have expected that Bethesda would be able to iron out the worst aspects that plagued the initial release in the intervening time, but unfortunately they're not modders, so they simply can't help with that. The game still disconnects randomly for no apparent reason. Enemies spawn in halfway submerged in solid matter or refuse to even acknowledge that you're standing right in front of them, pelting them with bullets. And do I really need to highlight the fact that the game runs like ass, dropping the frame rate for no apparent reason randomly and constantly stirring like Scatman John asking out his crush for a date? Shit like this has been excused for Bethesda games since time immemorial because they usually present enough varied content and storytelling to make the trade-off seem worth it. But with those two factors out of the way, the idea of giving them a free pass for still refusing to fix fundamental aspects of their game is ridiculous. Seriously, Bethesda, if this stuff has become such a running joke over the years that people willingly still buy your nonsense with the expressed purpose of uploading glitch montages onto YouTube in order to make people laugh, just stop recycling your core engine and build something new from the ground up, or license a decent engine. I hear Unreal isn't so expensive anymore. Or hell, you own id. Just use id Tech. Speaking of enemies and their behaviors, it's not like the AI would take home any prizes even if it works as intended. Gunfights usually ended up with me standing pretty much still while I carefully aimed my weapons on enclosing enemies if they were at or below my level, because enemies on similar levels as you do so little damage that it's not worth sprinting for cover. You can just let them wail on you while you pick them off one by one. It only ever gets tricky if you stumble into a zone you're clearly under-leveled for and you have to engage one or multiple enemies a few levels above you, at which point the game becomes a test of patience to see how long you can hold out backpedaling away from enclosing enemies, or taking potshots at them until you can finally get rid of their stupid amount of health. Because shit like this can stop your adventure dead in its tracks for minutes on end while you try to clear out a location through drawn out, repetitive and boring combat. And while I already mentioned the actual gameplay that you'll be doing for the most part, let me also just come forth and say it. Fallout 76 is basically a Fallout 4 multiplayer mod in a new map with some new enemies. And Fallout 4 was already highly iterative on what Bethesda did with Fallout 3, which in itself was barely more than Oblivion with guns. The multiplayer aspect is literally the only thing about this game that differentiates it from being Fallout Another One. The highly iterative nature of Bethesda's games is a joke at this point. So, in the end, this free trial week has not given me any incentive of buying this game after all. The just announced Battle Royale mode is utterly uninteresting to me, and it's just pathetic how Bethesda are late to a trend twice with the same game. First by delivering a survival game way after that genre ceased to be relevant, and now they're trying to catch up with the likes of Fortnite as well, when neither their shooting nor their crafting gameplay is anywhere near on par with that game. Maybe this game will become worth playing once Bethesda introduce NPCs with that promised update later this year. But right now, it only offers a repetitive core loop consisting of simplistic combat and eternally draining resource meters, with none of the payoff of leaving your mark on the wasteland. The scant, interesting bits of writing are wasted on a game world that feels empty and hollow. If Bethesda offer another free trial when the game is finished and actually has all of its content, maybe I'll revisit it, but I have absolutely no intention of playing this any further, as I've had my fill and then some.